The quiet in the mess hall at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. A low-frequency hum of industrial refrigeration units and the whisper of conditioned air flowing through overhead vents. It was punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a chair, the muted clink of utensils against government-issued trays, and the soft murmur of 100 private conversations. In the far corner, beneath a flickering fluorescent tube that cast everything in a sickly pallor, Lieutenant Commander Kate Brennan sat alone. Her attention was fixed on the tactical communications schematic displayed on her ruggedized tablet, the kind that could survive a 3-story drop or a dunk in salt water. A fork moved with mechanical precision from her tray to her mouth, some kind of meat product in gravy that the Navy optimistically called beef stroganoff. But she wasn't tasting it. Her mind was elsewhere, tracing signal pathways and calculating latency times for the new satellite uplink system she was integrating into the base's infrastructure. She was an island of perfect stillness in a sea of restless energy. The stillness shattered when 3 shadows fell across her table. Kate didn't look up immediately. She registered their presence the way a seismograph registers a distant tremor. Data to be noted, filed away, assessed for threat level. Through her peripheral vision, she cataloged the details. Marine Corps desert fatigues, tan boots that had seen real use, the particular swagger that came with force reconnaissance training. "Well, would you look at what we've got here?" The voice belonged to Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Cade, a man who looked like he'd been carved from a cliff face by someone who'd only read a description of human anatomy. 6'3", shoulders that could have been used as a battering ram, and a jaw that jutted out like a geographic feature. His 2 shadows, Corporal Hayes and Corporal Ortega, spread out in a casual but deliberate flanking maneuver that would have made their instructors proud. "The Navy's newest toy," Cade continued, his voice pitched to carry across the nearby tables. "All that top-secret clearance, all that hush-hush integration work, and what do they send us? A goddamn keyboard warrior who probably breaks a sweat opening a bag of Skittles." Hayes snickered, a sound like tearing paper. "Heard she's supposed to be some kind of communications genius, Gunny. Here to fix all our radio problems with her magic computer spells." Communications genius. Cade leaned forward, his knuckles resting on the metal surface of Kate's table, close enough that she could smell the Copenhagen wintergreen on his breath. "You know what we used to call communications geniuses? Nerds. Desk jockeys. The people who made sure the real warriors could talk to each other, while we did the actual fighting. Now they're giving them officers' bars and a seat at the big kids' table." He gestured dismissively at the silver oak leaves on Kate's collar. Kate continued scrolling through her power distribution diagram. Her expression remained perfectly neutral, as if she were studying something particularly fascinating about voltage regulators. She gave no indication she'd heard a word. This, apparently, was unacceptable. Cade's frustration manifested as a slight flush creeping up his thick neck. He was a man who ran on reactions, fear, anger, deference, and her silence was creating a vacuum that his ego couldn't tolerate. He nudged her tray with the back of his hand. The plastic cup of water rocked dangerously. "Word is you came from the teams," Cade said, leaning even closer, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone, but which actually carried clear across the mess hall. "That's rich. That's really goddamn rich. They're letting 5'0" computer nerds wear the trident now? What a joke. The whole program's gone soft." Ortega, emboldened by his leader's performance, decided to contribute. "Soft is right, Gunny. All this high-tech garbage, drones, satellites, cyber this and cyber that, they're trying to take the warrior out of warfare. That's why we're losing our edge." "Exactly," Cade boomed, straightening up and playing to his expanding audience. Several nearby tables had gone quiet, their occupants watching with the guilty fascination of motorists passing a car wreck. "This is the problem. This right here." He jabbed a thick finger in the direction of Kate's still bowed head. "They think a line of code is a substitute for a full magazine. They think a strong Wi-Fi signal means more than a strong man with a rifle." He paused, letting his words hang in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar. "You ask me? SEALs aren't worth a damn anymore." "Not a single damn." The words landed like physical objects in the sudden hush. With a final, deliberate act of contempt, Cade backhanded Kate's tray. It happened fast. The tray skittered across the table's surface with a metallic screech. The beef stroganoff slopping over the edges, green beans scattering like shrapnel. The plastic cup of water overturned, its contents spreading in a growing pool that reached the base of Kate's tablet before cascading off the edge onto the linoleum floor. The entire mess hall seemed to hold its breath. Kate Brennan did not flinch. For exactly 3 seconds, she counted them, an old habit from dive training where every second mattered. She remained perfectly still. Then, with an economy of motion that was somehow more unnerving than any outburst would have been, she powered down her tablet, slipped it into its waterproof sleeve, and stood. She picked up the soiled tray, walked it to the disposal window with measured steps, and scraped the contents into the waste bin. She placed the tray on the return rack. She turned and walked toward the exit, her footsteps even and unhurried, leaving behind a wake of stunned silence and the sour smell of spilled institutional food. She never looked back. Not at Cade, whose smirk was already curdling into something that looked almost like uncertainty. Not at the dozens of faces that tracked her movement across the room. Not even at the staff sergeant from the Army's 75th Ranger Regiment, who'd been sitting 2 tables over and who whispered to his companion, "That was either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the dumbest. Can't decide which." Part 2. Documentation. Kate's quarters were a windowless 8x10 box in the officers' barracks, notable only for the small red light above the door that indicated it was a SCIF, a sensitive, compartmented information facility. Inside, the air was cool and slightly stale, circulated by a dedicated ventilation system that ensured no conversations could be intercepted from adjacent rooms. There was no outburst when the door sealed behind her. No muttered cursing, no hurled objects, no kicks aimed at the metal footlocker at the base of her rack. Kate Brennan operated on a frequency that most people couldn't perceive. She sat at the compact desk that folded down from the wall, the only sound the quiet whir of her workstation's cooling fans spinning up as it recognized her biometric signature. She placed her tablet in its charging dock and opened a secure, encrypted log file on her terminal. The cursor blinked. A patient green metronome measuring time in digital heartbeats. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. Incident log, 2100Z, 14 October. Location, DFAC, FOB Sentinel. Personnel involved, GYSGT, Marcus Cade, USMC, CPL Hayes, USMC, CPL Ortega, USMC. She typed with clinical precision, transcribing their words as if they were lines of buggy code that needed debugging. Subject Cade initiated verbal confrontation. Derogatory language regarding standards within naval special warfare. Direct quote, "SEALs aren't worth a damn anymore." Physical action. Subject Cade intentionally displaced meal tray, causing spillage and equipment exposure to liquid. She paused, her mind replaying the event with perfect clarity. The angle of his arm, the velocity of impact, the splash pattern of the water, the precise distance between his position and hers. It was all just physics, vectors and momentum, cause and effect. Next, she opened a new window. Her credentials granted her authorized access to the base's C4ISR network, command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. She navigated to the security archives with the ease of someone who'd helped design the system's architecture. A few keystrokes brought up the feeds from the mess hall. She isolated camera 7, the one mounted in the corner with the clearest view of her table. She scrubbed through the timeline to the exact moment of the incident. There it was. A silent, grainy film of Cade's arrogance and her own deliberate non-response. She bookmarked the footage, noting the timestamp, 21:03:47 Zulu. She initiated a secure transfer protocol, creating triple redundant encrypted copies of the video file on 3 separate servers in 3 separate physical locations. She named it according to proper evidence handling procedures. DFAC_142OCT_2103Z.corroboration_01. She attached it to her log entry. Proof. An unbroken chain of custody. Documentation before escalation. The rules existed for a reason. They were a system, and Kate knew how to work systems. She'd been doing it since she was 8 years old, debugging her father's ham radio equipment, and optimizing the code for her school's robotics team. She closed the file. The task was complete. Her emotional state remained flat, not suppressed, but genuinely neutral. The insult was irrelevant. The disrespect was merely a symptom of a larger systemic issue, a bug in the human operating system that produced undesirable outputs. Cade and his men were variables that needed correcting. With the report filed in her private archives, she'd decide later whether to escalate it through official channels. She stood and began to methodically strip out of her uniform. The noise above, the posturing, the public theater, it was all static. White noise obscuring the signal. She needed to recalibrate, to return to a place where only the signal mattered. Part 3. The Deep. The base's combat dive training facility was a cathedral of concrete and chlorine, built half underground to maintain temperature stability. At this hour, 2300 local time, it was officially closed, but Kate's clearance and instructor certification gave her 24-hour access. The only illumination came from the dim red safety lights spaced along the walls, casting the deep end of the Olympic-sized pool in a hellish crimson glow. The air was thick with the sharp, clean tang of chemicals and the peculiar silence that comes from being in a large, empty space designed for noise and chaos. Kate moved through the deserted locker room with ritualistic precision. She laid out her equipment on the slatted wooden bench, a Draeger LARV rebreather, low profile and sleek. A frameless dive mask that molded to her face like a second skin. Jet fins worn smooth from years of use. A simple weight belt with enough lead to achieve neutral buoyancy at depth. Each piece was checked and double-checked. The hiss of the oxygen cylinder as she cracked the valve was a familiar whisper, almost a greeting. This was her sanctuary. The chaotic variables of the surface world, ego, politics, the endless jockeying for dominance, were nullified down here by the immutable laws of physics, pressure, temperature, gas expansion, the mathematics of survival. She slipped into the water with barely a ripple. The cold was a sharp, clean shock that stripped away the last residual traces of the mess hall's stale air. She didn't splash or thrash. She simply submerged, a seamless transition from one element to another. And with a few powerful, efficient kicks, she descended to the bottom of the 12-foot training tank. The pressure built in her ears, a familiar friend, and she equalized automatically, clearing her eustachian tubes without conscious thought. At the bottom, she settled into a cross-legged position on the pool's tiled floor. Her world contracted to the rhythmic bubbling of her rebreather, the soft green glow of her dive computer strapped to her wrist, and the distorted red light filtering down through 12 feet of water. Here, there were no egos. No performance anxiety. No need to prove anything to anyone. Just pressure, time, and the precise management of gases. Kate closed her eyes behind her mask. Her mind, freed from the static of social interaction, began to work in the way it worked best, processing problems, running simulations, calculating outcomes. She did not replay Cade's insults. That would be inefficient, a waste of processing power. Instead, she visualized vectors, force distribution, the physics of a three-body problem in a confined space. She traced theoretical lines of force from a shove, mapped the arc of a lunging arm, calculated the pivot point of a human body thrown off balance. She saw the brachial plexus, the radial nerve, the delicate architecture of the wrist, not as targets for violence, but as inputs for a control system. It was a form of meditation, but one rooted in practicality. The world above was loud, chaotic, driven by emotion and misperception. Here, in the crushing silence of the deep, only physics was true. Newton's laws didn't care about rank or gender or who had the louder voice. A body in motion stayed in motion unless acted upon by an external force. A joint could only bend so far before ligaments tore. Leverage, not raw strength, was the ultimate arbiter of physical conflict. For 60 minutes, she remained on the bottom, a silent statue in the red gloom. Her oxygen consumption was minimal. Years of training had taught her to relax completely, to let her metabolism slow to nearly meditative levels. She was not nursing a grudge. She was not fantasizing about revenge. She was preparing for a statistical probability. The data from the first incident suggested a high likelihood of escalation. Cade's psychological profile, based on his public behavior, his need for validation, his inability to process being ignored, indicated a near certain probability of a second, more aggressive interaction. He would interpret her silence as weakness, or worse, as disrespect. His ego would demand satisfaction. The system required correction, and correction required preparation. When she finally surfaced, breaking through the plane between water and air, the world felt thin and harsh. She emerged from the pool, water streaming from her wetsuit-clad form, and stood for a moment breathing in the chemical-tinged air. The world of noise and friction awaited above. But she was ready for it. She had re-established her baseline. She was calm, centered, and prepared to debug the system. Part 4. The Corridor. 2 days passed in a quiet hum of productivity. Kate integrated the new frequency-hopping spread spectrum protocols into the base's electronic warfare suite. The work was elegant, nearly invisible, the hallmark of good systems engineering. When it worked perfectly, nobody noticed. She spoke only when necessary, and her status reports to Commander Patricia Vance were models of concise technical writing. To the casual observer, she was exactly what Cade had accused her of being, a quiet technician, more comfortable with machines than people, content to let others grab the glory while she did the unglamorous work of keeping the infrastructure running. The whispers about the mess hall incident had faded into the background noise of base life, replaced by newer gossip about a supply sergeant caught running a side business in contraband energy drinks. The second confrontation came exactly when Kate's analysis predicted it would, and in precisely the environment her threat assessment had identified as most probable. The maintenance corridor connecting the secure operations center to the officers' barracks was a narrow, utilitarian tube of exposed conduit and metal grating. It ran for nearly 100 yards through the guts of the facility, lined with electrical junction boxes, cable runs, and the occasional recessed doorway leading to utility spaces. The security cameras here were older models. Kate had noted this in her initial base survey, with known blind spots and limited low-light capability. It was a place for quiet conversations, for shortcuts between buildings, and occasionally for less official business. Kate was returning from a late shift, her tablet bag slung over one shoulder, her footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. Her mind was still half occupied with the signal propagation problem she'd been working on. There was an anomalous latency spike in the tertiary satellite link that didn't make sense, and she was running through possible causes. She became aware of the three figures before she saw them. The air pressure changed slightly, 3 large bodies displacing atmosphere in a confined space. The ambient noise shifted. Her subconscious threat assessment system, honed by years of training, flagged the anomaly before her conscious mind caught up. Cade, Hayes, and Ortega emerged from a recessed doorway about 30 feet ahead, blocking the corridor. They'd been waiting. Cade had a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes, the expression of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. The overhead lighting, a single caged sodium lamp, cast harsh shadows that turned his features into something carved from stone. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low rumble that didn't echo in the sound-dampening space. "Look who's burning the midnight oil. Trying to impress the brass with how many buttons you can push, Lieutenant Commander?" Kate stopped approximately 8 feet away. Her posture remained relaxed, her hands visible and empty at her sides. Her eyes scanned the environment with the same methodical precision she brought to code review. Distance to each man, width of corridor, concrete walls offering no give. Large electrical junction box to her left, conduit runs overhead. Data points. Variables. A three-dimensional problem space. She said nothing. "Cat got your tongue, ma'am?" Hayes sneered, stepping forward slightly, crowding the space. "Or are you just scared? We heard you didn't file a complaint about the other day. Figured you knew your place in the food chain." "Probably doesn't know how to file a complaint," Ortega added, his voice thin and nervous. He was the weak link, Kate noted, the follower who was only brave in a pack. Probably just went back to her room and cried. Cade took another step forward, his bulk filling the narrow hallway. He was close enough now that Kate could smell the coffee on his breath, see the slight dilation of his pupils, read the tension in his shoulders. "We just want to have a conversation," he said, his tone mock reasonable. "Make sure there's no misunderstanding about your place here. See, me and my boys, we're the tip of the spear. We're the ones who go down range and do the work." He gestured dismissively at her. "You? You're the person who sharpens the spear. Important work, I guess. But let's not get confused about who actually wields it." Kate's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. This was the escalation. Verbal aggression, physical intimidation, isolation from witnesses. All variables accounted for in her threat model. She subtly shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. Her right hand, hanging loosely at her side, made a minute, nearly invisible gesture, activating the tiny body camera clipped to her belt beneath her jacket. The indicator light was infrared, invisible to the naked eye. The documentation continued. "Going to run and tell the colonel, ma'am?" Cade sneered, his patience finally breaking in the face of her unnerving calm. "Going to cry about how the mean Marines were disrespectful?" He reached out and gave her a hard shove on the shoulder, not hard enough to cause real harm, but enough to send a smaller person stumbling backward, enough to establish dominance, enough to humiliate. The shove was the catalyst, the input the system had been waiting for. What happened next would later be described by Hayes in his official statement as, "like she just fucking vanished, and then we were all on the ground." The base's JAG officer would eventually determine this was the most accurate description any of them could provide. The engagement lasted 9 seconds. As Cade's hand made contact with Kate's shoulder, she did not resist the force. She absorbed it, her body flowing with his momentum like water accepting a stone. She pivoted on her left foot, her right leg sweeping back, transforming his linear shove into rotational energy. Her left hand came up, not to block, but to guide his extended arm along its trajectory. Her right hand clamped onto his wrist with surgical precision, her fingers finding the exact space between the ulna and radius bones, where the radial nerve ran close to the surface. She didn't grab, she controlled. With a subtle, almost gentle rotation of her own body, she applied a basic wrist lock, rotational pressure against the joint's natural range of motion. Cade's forward momentum, now redirected through the fulcrum of his own wrist, carried him helplessly forward and down. A surprised grunt escaped his lips as his center of gravity disappeared, and the floor rushed up to meet him. In a single fluid motion, she had converted an aggressor into a shield, his large body now positioned between herself and a stunned Corporal Hayes. Corporal Ortega, reacting on pure instinct, lunged from her left. His hands reached out to grab her, his tactical training screaming at him to control the threat, to use his size advantage, to wrap her up. He expected her to be focused on Cade. This was his first mistake. Kate's situational awareness was not a cone of vision, it was a sphere. She perceived threats in 360 degrees, had trained for years to process multiple simultaneous inputs. As Ortega entered her space, she used her control over Cade's body as a pivot point. She stepped inside Ortega's reach, a move so counterintuitive that his brain couldn't process it fast enough. Instead of backing away from the larger opponent, she moved closer, collapsing the distance, negating his reach advantage. Her left hand, now free from guiding Cade's descent, shot out in a precise strike. Not a punch. Punching was inefficient, high risk, likely to cause injury to both parties. Instead, a stiffened finger strike that targeted the brachial plexus nerve cluster just below his collarbone, where the nerves were close to the surface and vulnerable. The impact was minimal, barely audible, a soft thump of flesh on flesh. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. An electrical shock of pure agony shot down Ortega's arm. His muscles went slack, the limb suddenly a useless appendage, hanging from his shoulder. His lunge faltered, his face contorting into a mask of shocked confusion as he stumbled backward, clutching his deadened arm. Simultaneously, Hayes tried to circle around the disoriented Cade to get at her from the right. But Kate had already moved to her next action, releasing the wristlock with a calculated push, not violent, just a precise transfer of energy that sent Cade stumbling directly into Hayes's path. The two Marines collided in an ungraceful tangle of limbs and muttered curses. 3 heartbeats. 3 threats neutralized. Kate Brennan stood in the center of the corridor in a perfectly balanced stance, her breathing barely elevated, her expression calm. She had not thrown a single punch or raised her voice. Cade was shaking his hand, his face pale with a mixture of pain and disbelief. Hayes was helping him stay upright, both of them off balance. Ortega leaned against the concrete wall, staring at his unresponsive arm, with the expression of a man whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally revised. The corridor was suddenly vast and silent, filled only with their heavy breathing. Kate looked at Cade, her gaze finally meeting his directly. It was a calm, analytical look, devoid of anger or triumph. "The conversation," she said quietly, her voice carrying absolute finality, "is concluded." She turned and walked away, her footsteps once again even and measured, echoing down the now unobstructed corridor. This time, there was no question of them following. Part 5. Consequences. The immediate aftermath was a study in cognitive dissonance. 3 Force Recon Marines, paragons of physical capability, men who could hike 50 miles with a 100-pound pack, who regularly scored expert on every weapons qualification, stood in a maintenance corridor like broken automatons, trying to process. An event that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of nature as they understood them. The sharp, searing pain in Cade's wrist was almost secondary to the ego-shattering shock. He'd pushed her. He remembered pushing her. And then there had been a blur of motion, a wrenching sensation in his wrist, and suddenly the floor had been rushing up to meet his face. "What the hell was that?" Ortega finally gasped, still trying to will his arm to respond to commands. The sensation was returning now, painful pins and needles, like the limb had been asleep for hours. Cade didn't answer. He was cradling his wrist, his mind replaying the engagement over and over, trying to find the moment where it had gone wrong. He'd had every advantage. Size, strength, numbers, surprise. And somehow, in less time than it took to breathe, she'd turned all of it against him. It was like being caught in a machine. No rage, no emotion, just cold, terrifying efficiency. "She hit me," Ortega said, his voice small. "But it didn't, it wasn't like getting hit. It was like she flipped a switch and my arm just stopped." Hayes, the only one of the 3 who'd escaped completely unscathed, looked down the empty corridor where Kate had disappeared. His throat was dry. "We need to report this," he said. "She attacked us. That's assault on a senior NCO. We need to—" "Shut up," Cade snapped, his voice rough. His mind was already working through the angles, and none of them were good. "Just shut the hell up and let me think." But thinking was difficult when your entire worldview had just been drop-kicked into a wall. Word spread, not officially, not yet, but through the underground network of gossip that existed in any military installation. It started with a maintenance tech who'd been in an adjacent utility space and heard the commotion. He'd cracked the door just in time to see 3 Marine Force Recon guys looking like they'd been hit by a truck, and the small Navy officer walking away like she was out for a Sunday stroll. By breakfast the next morning, the story had mutated into a dozen different versions, each more elaborate than the last. She'd used some kind of secret SEAL technique. She'd hit pressure points that made you pass out. She'd put all three of them in the hospital. The mockery that had followed Kate since her arrival curdled into something else. Not quite respect, not quite fear, but a wary recognition that maybe, just maybe, they'd misjudged her. People gave her more space in the hallways. Conversations dipped when she entered rooms. They weren't looking at a data clerk anymore. They were looking at an unknown quantity, and unknowns were dangerous. Kate, for her part, proceeded as if absolutely nothing had happened. She went directly from the corridor to her quarters, showered, changed into fresh utilities, and reported to her workstation in the operations center. She sat down, took a single deep breath to center herself, and began the next phase of the protocol. She opened a new formal incident report. The template was standard DoD format, used for everything from equipment failures to personnel disputes. Her entry was clinical, devoid of emotional content. Subject: report of unprofessional conduct and physical assault. Submitting officer: LCDR Kate M. Brennan. USN personnel involved: GY Sergeant Marcus Cade, USMC, Corporal Hayes, USMC, Corporal Ortega, USMC. Narrative: at approximately 0130Z, 17 October, in Maintenance Corridor 3 Gamma, undersigned was confronted and verbally harassed by subjects listed above. Subject Cade initiated unprovoked physical contact, shove to shoulder. In response, undersigned employed minimal non-injurious control techniques to create distance and de-escalate situation. Incident represents continuation of harassment pattern initiated 14 October. Reth: DFAC _14 OCT _2103Z CORROBORATIN _01. She paused, then created a new attachment. The video file from her body camera was crystal clear, the audio sharp. Every sneer, every taunt, every movement captured in perfect fidelity. She named the file according to proper evidence protocols. Corridor _17 OCT _0130Z, first name _01. She addressed the report to her direct superior, Commander Vance. She carbon copied the base master-at-arms and the staff judge advocate's office. She clicked send. The report vanished into the secure network with a soft chime. She had used their system to correct their behavior. Now the machinery of military justice would begin to turn. Part 6. The Hearing. The hearing was convened in a wood-paneled conference room that smelled of lemon polish and the particular gravity of institutional judgment. A long table dominated the space, its surface polished to a high gloss that reflected the overhead fluorescence. At the head of the table sat the base commander, Colonel James Reyes, USMC, a man whose face looked like it had been weathered by 40 years of service and bad coffee. Flanking him were the base sergeant major and Captain Maria Chen from the JAG Corps, her uniform crisp enough to cut paper. On one side of the table sat Cade, Hayes, and Ortega, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of righteous indignation, mixed with just the right amount of respect for the proceedings. They had their story straight. They'd rehearsed it. She had been unstable, confrontational, had completely misunderstood their friendly inter-service banter. In the hallway she'd attacked them without warning, clearly some kind of psychological break. They were the victims here. It was a classic he said, she said situation, and they were 3 decorated Marines with combat deployments. Who would a Marine colonel believe? On the other side sat Lieutenant Commander Brennan and her superior, Commander Patricia Vance. Kate was a portrait of calm, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression neutral as she looked directly at Colonel Reyes. Gunnery Sergeant Cade, the colonel began, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. You and your men stand accused of a pattern of harassment and assault against a fellow service member. How do you respond to these charges? Cade sat ramrod straight, every inch the professional Marine. Sir, with respect, the accusations are completely false. We have nothing but respect for Lieutenant Commander Brennan and her service. What happened in the dining facility was simple inter-service rivalry. A bit of teasing that maybe got out of hand, but nothing malicious. She seemed to take it the wrong way. He paused, letting that sink in. The incident in the hallway, sir, we were concerned for her well-being. She seemed agitated, unstable. When I reached out, literally just reached out to make sure she was okay, she attacked us, without warning. She put Corporal Ortega's arm out of commission and injured my wrist. Sir, I think the lieutenant commander may be suffering from some kind of stress-related issue that requires medical evaluation. Hayes and Ortega nodded in solemn agreement, their expressions conveying wounded innocence. Captain Chen made notes, her face professionally impassive. Colonel Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd been doing this job long enough to recognize a rehearsed story when he heard one, but he'd also been doing it long enough to know that what he suspected and what he could prove were two different things. He turned his gaze to Kate. Commander Brennan, your response? Kate's voice was clear and level. My response is detailed in my written report, sir. I have nothing to add at this time. Commander Vance spoke up. Colonel, with your permission, Commander Brennan's report contains corroborating evidence that may clarify the sequence of events. The colonel nodded to Captain Chen, who tapped a few commands into a laptop connected to a large monitor on the wall. The screen flickered to life. The first video was the grainy, silent footage from the mess hall security camera. The room watched as Cade and his men surrounded Kate's table. Even without audio, the body language was clear. The aggressive posturing, the intimidation tactics. They saw Cade lean over her, saw him gesture dismissively at her uniform insignia. And then they saw the backhand that sent her tray flying, food and water scattering across the table. The atmosphere in the room shifted, became heavier. Cade's face tightened slightly. Sir, that was just... You'll speak when spoken to, Gunnery Sergeant, Colonel Reyes said quietly. His voice had dropped about 10 degrees in temperature. Continue, Captain Chen. The screen went dark for a moment. Then it lit up again with a new video. The perspective was lower, slightly jerky at first, then stable. The timestamp in the corner read 17 OCT 013042Z. Body camera footage. The audio crackled to life, filling the silent room. Every word of the confrontation was captured with perfect clarity, trying to impress the brass with how many buttons you can push. Cat got your tongue, ma'am? Or are you just scared? You're the person who sharpens the spear. And then they heard Cade's voice. Going to run and tell the colonel, ma'am? Going to cry about how the mean Marines were disrespectful? They saw the shove, saw his hand lash out and make contact with Kate's shoulder. And then they saw what happened next. Captain Chen, at Colonel Reyes's gesture, slowed the footage to quarter speed. The room watched, mesmerized, as physics unfolded in ways that seemed to defy common sense. The pivot, the wrist lock, the nerve strike that Ortega never saw coming, the controlled push that sent Cade stumbling into Hayes. 9 seconds of flawless, economical violence. And at the end, Cade's voice, quiet and final. The conversation is concluded. The video ended. The screen went dark. The silence in the room was absolute. A dense, suffocating silence filled with the death of a carefully constructed lie. Cade, Hayes, and Ortega were frozen, their faces ashen. Colonel Reyes slowly sat back in his chair. He looked at the 3 Marines, and his expression was not one of rage, but of deep, profound disappointment, mixed with something harder, disgust. He saw it all now, the bullying, the arrogance, and more than that, he saw Kate's incredible, terrifying restraint. She hadn't hurt them. She could have. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize the level of skill on that video. It was something rare and dangerous, the kind of capability that took years to develop and even more discipline to control. She could have shattered Cade's wrist with a simple twist. Could have dislocated Ortega's shoulder instead of just deadening the nerve. Could have sent Hayes face first into that concrete wall. She had chosen not to. She had chosen control over violence, correction over punishment. The silence stretched for another 5 seconds, an eternity in that charged atmosphere. Finally, Colonel Reyes turned his gaze to Kate. His eyes, which had been hard and skeptical at the beginning of this hearing, now held something different. Respect. The real kind. Earned and undeniable. "Lieutenant Commander Brennan," he said quietly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority despite its low volume. "Thank you for your professionalism and your restraint. And thank you for documenting the truth." He turned back to the three Marines, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. "Gunnery Sergeant Cade, you and your men are a disgrace to the uniform of the United States Marine Corps." Each word was clipped, precise, a verbal execution. "You dishonored yourselves, your unit, and every Marine who has ever worn this uniform with integrity." Cade's face had gone from ash pale to a mottled red. His jaw worked, but no words came out. "You will each receive non-judicial punishment under Article 15 of the UCMJ," Colonel Reyes continued. "The specific charges are assault, conduct unbecoming, and creating a hostile work environment. Gunnery Sergeant Cade, you are reduced in rank to sergeant, effective immediately. You will forfeit half your pay for 2 months. All 3 of you are reassigned to non-leadership billets, and I am recommending your immediate transfer off this installation." He paused, letting it sink in. "Furthermore, this incident will be noted in your permanent records. If I ever, and I mean ever, hear of any of you engaging in similar conduct, I will personally ensure that your military careers end with a dishonorable discharge. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," they mumbled in ragged unison. "I can't hear you." "Yes, sir." Louder now, though the words tasted like ashes. "Dismissed. Report to the Sergeant Major outside. He'll inform you of your new duty assignments." The 3 men stood, rendered stiff, mechanical salutes, and filed out of the room. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a coffin. When they were gone, Colonel Reyes rubbed his face with both hands, a brief moment of weariness showing through the command persona. "Commander Vance," he said, looking at Kate's superior, "I owe you and your sailor an apology. This should never have happened on my base." Commander Vance nodded. "Appreciated, Colonel, but I think the apology should go to Commander Brennan." The colonel turned to Kate. "Commander, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you had to deal with that behavior, and I'm sorry it took video evidence for me to see the truth immediately. That's a failure of leadership on my part." Kate's expression remained neutral, professional. "Sir, with respect, you followed the process. You reviewed the evidence. That's exactly what the system is designed to do. The system," Reyes said with a slight bitter smile, "shouldn't require one of my officers to be assaulted before it kicks in. But you handled it. Well, you handled it perfectly. That level of restraint under physical assault, that's not just training. That's character." He stood, and everyone else in the room stood with him. "For what it's worth, Commander, I'd be honored to have you serve in any unit under my command. The Marine Corps has a lot to learn from the way you conducted yourself." Kate rendered a crisp salute. "Thank you, sir. If there's nothing else, I have a systems integration test scheduled in 30 minutes. The colonel returned the salute, and there was something in his eyes that might have been amusement. Of course she had work to do. Why would a little thing like a formal hearing interfere with the mission? "Dismissed, Commander." Kate and Commander Vance left the conference room and walked in silence down the corridor for a few moments. Finally, Vance spoke. "You know, Kate, most people in your situation would be angry, or at least, I don't know, something." "I am something, ma'am," Kate replied. "I'm satisfied that the system worked." "That's it? The system worked?" "That's it." Vance shook her head slowly. "You're either the most zen person I've ever met, or you're a robot. I haven't decided which." The corner of Kate's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile she'd shown in days. "Could be both, ma'am." Part 7. The Formation. The next morning dawned clear and cold over Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The sun rose over the eastern perimeter, casting long, sharp shadows across the main parade ground. a flat expanse of packed dirt and painted lines where the entire base command assembled for formal occasions. This was one of those occasions. By 0630, the entire command was in formation. Marines in their rows, Army personnel in theirs, Navy and Air Force detachments in their designated positions. Nearly 800 personnel standing at rigid attention in the pre-dawn chill, their breath misting in the air. There was a tension in the formation, a buzz of anticipation that rippled through the ranks like an electrical current. Everyone knew this wasn't routine. The grapevine had been working overtime, and while the details were sketchy, everyone knew something had gone down involving the Force Recon guys and that quiet Navy officer. Colonel Reyes stood at the podium on the raised platform at the front of the formation. His voice, amplified by the base-wide address system, carried to every corner of the parade ground. "This morning," he began, his words landing like hammer blows in the still air, "we are here to address a failure of discipline, a failure of character, and a failure of leadership." The formation went absolutely silent. Even the morning wind seemed to die down. Over the past week, 3 Marines under my command engaged in a pattern of harassment and assault against a fellow service member. They used their size, their numbers, and their positions to intimidate. They mocked. They belittled. And when their target refused to react, they escalated to physical violence. He paused, letting the words sink in. The service member they targeted was smaller than them, held a different rank structure, came from a different branch. Some might have looked at her and assumed she was an easy target. Another pause. The word "her" rippled through the formation like a shockwave. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. Not because she retaliated with violence. She didn't. Not because she broke regulations. She didn't. She was wrong because the officer they targeted is a decorated naval special warfare operator with more combat deployments than the 3 of them combined. Because she has capabilities they couldn't comprehend. And because when they assaulted her, she defended herself with exactly the minimum force necessary, no more, no less. And then she trusted the system to deliver justice. Colonel Reyes gripped the edges of the podium. Honor, courage, and commitment are not just words we stencil on our walls. They are not just phrases we recite. They are the standards we are sworn to uphold, every day, in every action. 3 Marines under my command failed to meet those standards. They brought dishonor upon themselves, upon their unit, and upon the Marine Corps. His voice hardened. Gunnery Sergeant Cade, Corporal Hayes, Corporal Ortega, front and center. There was a collective intake of breath across the formation. The 3 men, now just Sergeant Cade after his reduction in rank, detached from their units and marched to the front. Their faces were grim, their movements stiff. They halted before the podium and stood at attention, eyes fixed on the horizon, unable to meet the gaze of 800 pairs of eyes boring into their backs. Colonel Reyes read the formal charges and the findings. He detailed the punishments: reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, reassignment to non-leadership positions, transfer off base, pending approval. His voice was cold, clinical, the tone of a surgeon excising diseased tissue. It was a public professional execution. Then he did something no one expected. Lieutenant Commander Kate Brennan, front and center. Kate emerged from the Navy detachment, her stride calm and measured as always. She marched to the front of the formation and halted beside the 3 disgraced Marines, rendering a crisp salute to the colonel. He returned it. Then he turned to address the formation again. Commander Brennan demonstrated the highest ideals of a service member. When confronted with unprofessional and aggressive behavior, she responded not with emotion, but with discipline. She showed restraint when she had every right, every legal right, to use greater force. She trusted the system of justice to work, and she provided that system with irrefutable evidence. He turned to face Kate directly. She has taught this command a lesson about what true strength looks like. It's not about who can yell the loudest or who can throw the hardest punch. True strength is the discipline to control yourself, to respond proportionally, and to trust in the institutions we've sworn to uphold. The entire base was silent, except for the flutter of flags in the morning breeze. Commander Brennan, on behalf of my command and the United States Marine Corps, I offer you a formal and public apology for the disgraceful conduct you were subjected to. You deserved better. You deserved to work in an environment free from harassment and intimidation. We failed you, and for that, I am truly sorry. He turned his head, fixing his gaze on Cade. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous command that somehow carried across the entire parade ground. Sergeant Cade, render a salute to Lieutenant Commander Brennan. For a moment, a long, painful moment, Cade hesitated. His body was rigid, his face a mask of humiliation and suppressed rage. Then, under the crushing weight of the colonel's stare and the silent judgment of 800 of his peers, he complied. He raised his hand in a salute. It was mechanically perfect. His training was too ingrained for it to be otherwise, but it was spiritually broken. It was the salute of a man forced to acknowledge a truth that shattered his worldview, that the person he'd mocked and attacked was, in every way that mattered, his superior. Kate met his gaze for one brief second. Then she returned the salute, her movements clean and precise, devoid of any hint of triumph or satisfaction. It was not a victory, it was a restoration of order. Dismissed, Colonel Reyes said. The formation dissolved into organized chaos as units broke off and headed toward their morning duties. But the conversations were different now. The glances toward Kate carried a different weight. Part 8. Return to Signal. The final scene of this particular drama played out not on the parade ground, but back in the quiet, humming glow of the operations center. The atmosphere had changed. The whispers about Kate were gone, replaced by something else, a respectful distance, an acknowledgement that they were in the presence of someone who operated on a different level. Marines, sailors, airmen, and soldiers alike would nod respectfully when they passed her in the corridors. They gave her workspace a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of recognition that they were in the presence of a different class of operator. Kate sat at her terminal, fingers moving across the holographic keyboard with unconscious grace. She was analyzing signal propagation patterns from a subsurface drone swarm, complex data streams that resolved into coherent patterns under her focused attention. It was just another problem to be solved. Another system to be optimized. Commander Vance approached from behind, her footsteps soft on the raised flooring. She stood for a moment, watching the elegant flow of data cascading across Kate's screens. Report came in on that drone swarm, Vance said quietly. They're having trouble with signal propagation in the littoral zone. Too much thermal layering and multipath interference from the seafloor topology. She slid a datapad onto Kate's desk. Next mission brief. Thought you'd want to get ahead of it. Kate didn't look up. She simply tapped a control, opening a new window and importing the mission data. The holographic display shifted, showing a three-dimensional map of a contested coastline. Red icons blinked where the drones were losing their data links. Her mind was already processing variables, calculating optimal frequencies, modeling potential solutions. Commander Vance turned to leave but paused. She looked at Kate, this small, quiet figure who had single-handedly recalibrated the culture of an entire forward operating base without ever raising her voice or deviating from regulations. Kate, she said, and the use of her first name made Kate glance up briefly. That was well done. All of it. Kate's fingers never stopped moving across the keyboard. A command line appeared, rerouting a communications satellite to focus a tight beam transmission on the target area. The red icons on her map began to flicker, then slowly turned green. Problem solved. Correction was achieved, ma'am, Kate said quietly, her voice nearly lost in the hum of the machines. The system worked as designed. Is that really all it is to you? A system malfunction that needed correcting? Kate was quiet for a moment, her eyes tracking data streams. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. The world runs on systems, Commander. Communication protocols, laws of physics, regulations and procedures. When the systems work, everything functions smoothly. When they don't, when variables like ego or prejudice introduce errors, you get bad outputs. harassment, assault, injustice. She typed another command sequence. I just corrected the errors and let the system process the result. That's all. Commander Vance shook her head slowly, a small smile on her face. You know what, Kate? I think you might actually believe that. I do, ma'am. Well then, Vance straightened. Carry on, Commander, we've got a mission to run. Yes, ma'am. As Vance walked away, Kate returned her full attention to the screens in front of her. The incident with Kate and his men was filed away in her memory, categorized and archived. It was a closed file, a completed task. The future was a stream of incoming data, problems waiting to be solved, systems waiting to be optimized. Somewhere in the base, 3 former Force Recon Marines were learning what it meant to fall from grace. They were scrubbing floors, inventorying supplies, doing the grunt work that new recruits did. Their careers were effectively over. The stigma of what they'd done would follow them for whatever time they had left in uniform. But that wasn't Kate's concern. Her concern was the signal propagation problem in Grid Sector 7 Charlie. The thermal layer boundary was creating a refraction angle that was scattering the UHF transmissions. But if she adjusted the frequency modulation and implemented an adaptive beamforming algorithm, her fingers danced across the keyboard. The problem was already being solved. Outside, the sun climbed higher over forward operating base Sentinel. The day's operations continued. Helicopters lifted off from the flight line, patrols headed out beyond the wire. In 1,000 different ways, the mission continued, and in the quiet heart of the operations center, surrounded by the soft glow of screens and the gentle hum of cooling fans, Lieutenant Commander Kate Brennan did what she did best. She found the signal in the noise. She corrected the system, and she moved on to the next problem. Because that's what operators did. The mission always continued.